For the second half of the lecture, we're going to talk about different types of feedstuffs or, feed composition. What is actually in these different diets? So a feedstuff is just any component of a diet that serves a useful function. And up until now, we've really just been talking about the different array of nutrients that diets provide, anywhere from energy to vitamins and minerals, all that good stuff. But in terms of ingredients and feed stuff, it could have a different purpose as well. So it may not be just for nutrients. So these ingredients could provide bulk. So we talked about that bulk density. So it could increase the volume of the diet, decreasing the density. It can reduce oxidation. So oxidation is a big problem in feedstuffs and diets because that's the damaging part of the environment that it has to survive. So we may add these ingredients to help reduce oxidation of the feed. These ingredients could help emulsify fats, right? Help break down these fats in the diet, add flavor, color, or any other kind of palatability components, right, to make this diet more palatable. So we're really going to go through just the different options we have, these different types of feedstuffs, and who is going to eat these different types of feed. So our first category are high moisture forages. So these are the grasses that are fresh, right? So fresh, green, chop, pasture, right? So having these animals out on pasture, free range as well. So any sort of free range plants. But also you can get some high moisture forages from food processing too, like in cannery, food crop residue, right? So anything that they're not using for human consumption, any of these residues they can use and consider high moisture forages. So another class of feedstuff or group of feedstuff is silage, and silage has been around for a long time and is used as a staple for many diets, especially for cattle. And it's just a material that's produced by controlled fermentation of this high moisture herbage or these high moisture forages. So it can be made from a bunch of different types of plants. So usually it's made from corn, grass, alfalfa, the legume family like alfalfa, or sorghum. And sorghum is similar to corn and it grows, it's a little more drought tolerant than corn and grows in some places that corn doesn't. But essentially, they create these mounds of this high moisture herbage or plants, and then they cover it usually with plastic, something like that, to create an anaerobic environment to help ferment this high moisture content of feed. And the material produced from that is considered silage. And if they do this process correctly, it can be stored and kept indefinitely. So it's a great source for these people out in the country. So another class or group would be our dry forages. So these guys are our hays. So these guys are, cut grasses or legumes, the like alfalfa or even cereal crops like oats and wheat. And these guys are cut, but then they must dry out in the field before they bale it and before they store it. And so there is a harvesting and a processing way to bale these dry forages. So our next class is the roughages, and roughage just has a very high fiber content. So pretty much anything with a greater than 18% crude fiber is considered a roughage. So these are our dry hays, our silage, these are considered roughage. But even like higher fiber content would be the straws, chaff, fodder, stover. So all these things are considered a roughage. So on the left picture we have here is chaff, and then on the right we have some stover. It's really the leftover um, stuff from corn, the corn husks and the stalks and everything. And then fodder is just a kind of a general term for some of the hay and silage. It's just a feed term for the hay and the silage. But we've got some other products that are over 18% crude fiber that maybe we don't think of as much as feed, but corn cobs, shells, pretty much any seed hulls, sugarcane, and even animal wastes can be considered roughage, because if you think about what's coming out, it definitely has the high fiber content. So if we talk about forages and roughages kind of all together as kind of a category of feed, and who do we feed this type of feed stuff to? And we usually feed herbivores this, right? So high cellulose content, high fiber content. So these guys generally are fed to our herbivores. And they have high fiber, but they tend to have low digestibility due to all that cellulose, right? And it depends on the type of forage or roughage for the protein levels. They tend to be higher in our legumes, such as alfalfa. The mineral content is variable. It just depends on what type it is as well. They tend to be fairly good in calcium, magnesium, potassium, but they can be low in phosphorus. And then the trace minerals we talked about, back in our mineral lecture, those trace minerals really kind of depend on where they're grown. So it's in the soil and how much the plant actually absorbs those trace minerals. So what are some factors that can affect the forage composition? So, the digestibility of it, the quality, things like that. So the stage of maturity is referring to the plant cycle. So when the grass or whatever the forage may be is harvested, what stage in the plant cycle is it being harvested? So in the picture here we have immature cutting on the right and mature cutting on the left. So you notice there's some seeds and flowering on the grass in the mature cutting, but not so much in the immature cutting. So when you talk about the digestibility of the forage, more mature plants tend to have a decrease in digestibility. So it just depends on when you cut the grass and what stage of that plant's life cycle, whether it's more mature or less mature or immature. Now, fertilization, so you can fertilize the soil it grows in, right? So if you fertilize the soil it grows in, you're probably going to increase the mineral content in the forage itself. And that has been shown to possibly increase digestibility as well if you fertilize these crops. So another factor that can affect this forage composition or quality of the forage is harvesting and storage. So when you harvest the crop, you have to go through a harvesting process which can damage the plants, as well as if you don't store it correctly, there can be some damage as well. So some of these things that can happen, we can have some sun bleaching. So on the picture on the left, you notice how the outsides of the bales are kind of a straw yellow, kind of brown, and that is sun bleaching, because in the middle area you notice that it's green, and that's the alfalfa that hasn't been sun bleached, but still all of it's dry. It just has been sun bleached. And the sun bleaching can decrease the carotenes. Specifically, we talked about beta carotene being fairly important. These are all precursors to that vitamin A. So if we decrease, it just kind of decreases the quality of that forage by sun bleaching. Now, another problem is when you lay out that crop to dry before you store it, it can be rained on, right? So if it doesn't dry out completely and it gets rained on, then it's called leaching. So if it gets rained on, it has this water leaching effect, and essentially that can decrease the soluble carbohydrates in the grass, and it can also decrease the nitrogen levels as well. So again, you're just kind of decreasing the quality of that hay, of that forage, if this happens. So the ideal thing is to dry it as rapidly as possible before storing it, so that you avoid some of this leaching process as well. And you can get moldy hay too if it gets wet and is not stored correctly as well. And then there's just a loss of leaf. So when the leaves of especially the legumes, when you harvest the plants, you're doing damage to the plants, and you just get a loss of the leaves, which is just kind of a natural problem with the harvesting process. So now that we've talked about kind of the bulk feed, we're going to talk a little bit more about the concentrates. So this next class really has to do with energy concentration. So these foods are high in energy and calories, so they're meant to, add energy to the diet, increase that energy demand with these different concentrates. So cereal grains are a big one. So anything, from the grass family that's creating these cereal grains, corn, rice, wheat, oats, all those guys are in this family. Molasses. Molasses is sugar. So it's a process of making sugar. You get molasses. So essentially it has high calorie content. It can be added to feed for palatability, things like that. Beet and citrus pulp. So these kind of starchy vegetables, such as a beet, they create this pulp or this shredded product that you can add to feed. It has kind of a lot of fiber in it as well, so it adds some energy to the feed. A little bit of a bulk feed as well. Animal and vegetable fats. So that's pretty obvious for energy, right? Our fats are definitely the highest source of energy, so we can add these animal and vegetable fats to the diet. Brewery byproducts, so that top picture on the right shows you this, they call it brewery grain. So, we make beer from, wheat and hops, and so they have this leftover product from that process, and it can be used as a high energy concentrate. So if we look more closely at the cereal grains, they're high in starch. So, lots of carbohydrates, lots of energy, and these are pretty much all the seeds from different grasses. So I know you may not think corn is a grass, but it is. Corn, sorghum, wheat, barley, oat, all these guys are in the cereal grass family. So they're high in starch and high in carbohydrates, but they tend to be fairly low in protein. So that means they could be potentially deficient in some of those important essential amino acids that we talked about before. So you just got to watch out for diets high in these cereal grains. But they're definitely good for adding energy to a diet. The holes or the outer parts of these seeds are called hulls, and those are the fairly indigestible parts. So we're really just looking for the seeds of these grasses when we're talking about the cereal grains. And that indigestible hull is what we use as chaff, so a roughage, right? So we can use all parts of these plants for different purposes. So now we'll talk about the protein concentrates. So a lot of those energy concentrates were, more starch-based or fat-based, but now we're talking about protein. So these guys are great sources of amino acids, and specifically that nitrogen source that we require. So these guys tend to be a little more expensive, and they're used very specifically in diets. So where do these protein concentrates come from? Well, our animal meats, right? Bone meal, that's our top picture on the right. We can use marine and avian meals. So when we talk about fish and fish processing, as well as feathers from our poultry, we can make meals out of that as well. And then when we talk about our plant-based ones, and we'll go through these more individually as well, we have our oil seed meals. So commonly used are cottonseed and soybean, and we use those seeds and beans and turn them into a meal, and that's the second picture on the right. Um, we can use the seeds themselves and dried grains too. They do have some protein in them, but again, we talked about those guys being higher in starch than in protein. But some other sources, we do have some single-celled sources, and these are our yeast, algae, bacteria. So the third picture on the right is yeast. So we can add these guys into diets as well for good sources of protein. And then we also have the non-protein nitrogen. So we talked a little bit about this in class because really some of these animals are just really looking for nitrogen. We're kind of talking about our ruminants, and we can add specifically the nitrogen itself instead of adding protein. So on the bottom right there is urea. So we can specifically add urea or even ammonia into these diets. So as we know, protein is very important for our amino acids. We got to get that nitrogen, but it's really critical for young growing animals and these high producing adults such as dairy cattle. And when we talk about protein supplements, we're usually talking about over 20% crude protein, even though a lot of these guys are well over 20%, even up into the 80% crude protein. So let's look at some of these animal sources. So our meat, bone, blood meal, these guys are very high crude protein. And they come from the inedible meats, so from the meat processing plants, the rendering plants, anything that is not used in the human world, human consumption. But these guys have been banned in the US as a feed, as a supplement for ruminants due to the bovine spongiform encephalopathy, so also known as mad cow disease. So they've just banned it across the board for the use in ruminants. But we can use this in other animals because it is a very good source of protein, very high in protein, very digestible. So it is a great source of protein. We can also use feather meal from poultry. So I know many of you are probably thinking feathers are not very digestible, so they have to go through an extensive cooking process to be able to become digestible. But if you notice, this is probably one of our highest protein levels. So it's over 85% crude protein. So very good protein source. Just you got to make sure we make it digestible. So if we look at some other animal sources, we've got milk, right? So these dried milk products, either skim milk, whole milk, buttermilk, these guys are excellent sources of protein, but they can be more expensive, and they can also be damaged or impaired in the processing by overheating. So you just got to watch out for that because you're going to denature the proteins. Now, the marine sources, these guys can either be fish caught, right, or fish residue from processing for human consumption. And the thing about fish, they can be an excellent source of protein, but it just depends on the fish quality. So if you have, any sort of low fish quality due to decomposition, rancidity, so these guys decompose very quickly, and so you have to store them properly to be able to get a good quality fish and a good source of protein. Now, the plant sources, most of these guys are derived from soybean or cottonseed, and they turn them into meals. So on the bottom left, you have your soybeans turned into soybean meal, and the cottonseed turned into cottonseed meal. And we call these guys oil seeds because they do have a high percent of oil in them. And to be able to make them into a meal, they have to remove the oil from the seed. And they do that a couple different ways that we won't go through to produce these dry meals. Now, most of these guys have, fairly high crude protein, over 40%, but they have less fat. So they removed the oil, which you have removed some of the energy value as well. And so the energy value is variable between these different oil seed meals. It just depends on the processing and how they create the meal and how they remove the oil. But these guys are highly digestible, which is great. They have a moderate biological value, which is fairly good, but it's overall less than many of the animal protein sources. So it is a good option, though, for a protein source. So another group of feedstuff, and you can put these into two categories. I just kind of lumped them together, vitamins and minerals, because we've talked extensively about them already. We do have our essential and non-essential vitamins and minerals, and so you can either add them, directly to the diet. You can give them as supplements. Like I have an example of a salt block for horses. They add a bunch of vitamins and minerals into the salt block. And so the idea is the horse can lick it as it needs those different vitamins and minerals. But often we just add it straight to their diet as well. So that's kind of it for all the kind of essential feedstuffs that we have in diets, but we also have non-nutritive additives. So these guys are non-nutritive, meaning they are not essential for growth or anything like that, but we add them because they do have some benefits. So these guys are the antibiotics, antioxidants, buffers, colors, flavorings, emulsifying agents, enzymes, hormones, even medicine. So these guys are, they're not nutrients, but they do have some other benefits, and that's why we use them and add them into our feed. So I'm just going to go through two of them, just go through antibiotics and hormones specifically because they bring up the most controversy, I think, in our society. So antibiotics are fed at a low level in the diet to improve growth and the overall health of the animal, and it has found been very resourceful. But, you have to consider, what about antibiotic resistance? Is it adding to the resistance of bacteria in the environment, in humans? Because we eat these animals that have been given the antibiotics, and they may have those resistant bacteria or creating those resistant bacteria. And it's a big controversy, right? You see a lot of food out there that say, not treated with antibiotics, not given antibiotics. Um, but, in the studies, the bacteria that are gaining resistance are these low virulent strains, meaning they're maybe not as dangerous, if you want to quote unquote, dangerous, um, in place of virulent. So do the benefits outweigh the risk? And for a lot of farmers, the answer is yes. So they are continued to be used in our animals and in our feed. So, it's just something you have to ask yourself, and do some research on, and decide what you think, as a consumer. Now, hormones are another controversial additive, right? So they use growth hormones, estrogens, androgens, even progesterone, thyroid hormone, adrenal cortical hormone. So these guys have a bunch of different effects, but in general, they're all used essentially to help with the growth, but also, especially the steroid hormones, those androgens, are used for feed efficiency. So that means that the animal is going to eat, what it eats is going to use in its system better, essentially. Um, so, but there's also a lot of controversy around hormones as well, that you're eating these animals that have been given these hormones, and how may they affect our bodies, um, maybe adversely. So again, it's another controversial topic that, I encourage you to do some research about, and have your own opinions, as a consumer. So next time, I know this was a short lecture this time. We're kind of learning how to do this online teaching, and I encourage you guys to reach out to me if you have any questions, or anything about the process, and I will continue to be in communication with you guys via Canvas. Um, but next time, so we kind of jumped around a little bit. We kind of covered chapter 17, 19, little bit of 18, so, and 20. So we'll finish up kind of this section with feeding, next time, with feeding standards, kind of more the preparation, processing, sanitation, things like that, and what are the standards, and controls that we have in place for that. So that'll be next time. Okay.